The first truck arrived in 1983. Nobody remembered the exact date. Not even Ethan Carter. What he remembered was the smell. Warm grain, sweet corn, yeast, barley. The scent drifted across the pasture long before the truck reached the fence line. Ethan was only 14 then, helping his father repair a gate when the dump truck rolled slowly down the dirt road separating their farm from Lawson Creek Distillery. The driver climbed out. "Where do you want it?" Samuel Carter looked confused. "Want what?" The driver pointed toward the truck bed. "Spent mash." Samuel blinked. "The leftovers?" The driver nodded. "Distillery wants rid of it." Silence. Samuel looked at the truck, then at the grain, then back at the truck. "How much?" The driver laughed. "Free." That answer made Samuel smile immediately, because farmers understood one universal truth. Free feed deserved attention. The first load got dumped beside the eastern fence. Then another. Then another. By autumn it became routine. The distillery produced whiskey. Whiskey produced spent grain. Spent grain had to go somewhere. For 12 years. That somewhere became the Carter farm. Most neighboring farmers thought Samuel was crazy, especially because the grain arrived wet. Heavy, messy, complicated to store, complicated to handle, complicated to use. Dale Harper voiced the county's opinion one afternoon. "Why are you fooling with that stuff?" Samuel leaned against the fence. "Because it's free." Dale pointed toward the steaming pile. "It's garbage." Samuel smiled. "Then don't take any." That ended the conversation. Mostly. But the jokes never stopped. At the co-op people called it whiskey slop. Distillery leftovers. Brewer's garbage. Nobody viewed it as valuable. Nobody except Samuel. And eventually Ethan. The Carter farm sat on rolling Kentucky ground outside a small town where most people raised conventional hogs. Standard breeds. Standard feed. Standard methods. Everything looked roughly the same. The Carter place didn't. Because Samuel kept experimenting. Every load of spent mash got mixed with other feed ingredients. Corn, hay, pasture forage. Different combinations. Different approaches. Most attempts failed. Some worked. A few worked surprisingly well. One evening when Ethan was 17, Samuel stood beside a hog pen watching animals finish another feeding. "Notice anything?" Ethan looked over. "What?" Samuel pointed. "The pigs." Silence. "They look like pigs." His grandfather laughed. "Yes." Long pause. "Healthy pigs." Ethan looked again, then frowned. Because Samuel was right. The hogs looked different. Broader. Heavier. Calmer. Their coats shined. Growth rates improved. Feed costs dropped. Small advantages at first. Then larger ones. Samuel never became rich from it. But year after year, the farm survived difficult markets better than neighboring operations. The spent grain helped. Nobody wanted to admit it. But it helped. Then Samuel died in 1994. The farm passed to Ethan, along with hundreds of acres, a modest hog operation, and 12 years of habits. Most people expected changes immediately. They didn't understand Ethan very well, because Ethan's favorite activity involved studying things other people ignored. 3 months after inheriting the farm, he stood beside the fence watching another spent grain truck unload. The driver looked over. "You still taking this stuff?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." The driver shrugged. "Most folks wouldn't." Silence. Then, "I know." The driver laughed. "You planning to feed pigs forever?" Ethan looked toward the hog lots. Rows of standard white hogs moved around feeding areas. Then toward distant pastures. Then back again. "No." The driver frowned. "What?" Ethan smiled slightly. Thinking. Dangerous word. Very dangerous. The next year the county started hearing rumors. Never a good sign. Rumors usually meant Ethan Carter had another idea, and Ethan's ideas rarely looked normal. Dale Harper found out first. Naturally, he drove past the Carter farm one spring morning and nearly slammed on the brakes. Then reversed. Then stared. Then got out. "No." Ethan looked up from a fence post. "Morning, Dale." Dale pointed toward the pasture. "No." Ethan followed his finger. A group of unusual pigs rooted through fresh grass beneath oak trees. Red pigs. Black pigs. Spotted pigs. Long-bodied pigs. Nothing like commercial hogs. Silence. Then, "What are those?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Pigs." Dale stared. "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." Dale folded his arms. "Normal pigs." Ethan looked toward the animals. "Those are normal somewhere." That answer irritated Dale immediately, because Ethan answered ridiculous questions like weather reports. Simple. Calm. Impossible to argue with. The truth started months earlier. While researching feed efficiency, Ethan discovered heritage hog breeds, older genetics, older bloodlines, animals largely abandoned by industrial agriculture. Most grew slower, produced different meat, thrived outdoors, handled forage better, and, most importantly, utilized alternative feed sources extremely well, including spent grain. That interested Ethan immediately. He ordered books, called breeders, visited farms, filled kitchen tables with notes. One evening, Emily Carter walked into the farmhouse and stopped. Maps, feed studies, breed charts, market reports, paper everywhere. She stared. Oh no. Ethan looked up. What? Emily pointed. The table. Silence. What about it? That means you're thinking. Ethan smiled. Yes. Emily sat down slowly. Dangerous. Very dangerous. What kind of thinking? He pointed toward a photograph. A heritage Berkshire hog. Dark coat. Strong frame. Beautiful animal. Emily looked at it. Then at him. Then back again. No. 6 months later, the first breeding stock arrived. The county laughed immediately. Of course it did. Because heritage hogs sounded suspiciously similar to going backward. At least according to everyone else. Why would you raise old pigs? Rick Harlow asked. Ethan shrugged. Why not? Because they're old. Silence. Then. They aren't dead. Nobody appreciated that answer. The laughter intensified when people learned Ethan planned to pasture them. And you spent grain heavily in feeding programs. The county decided this was wonderful entertainment. At the co-op, Dale announced dramatically. Good news, everybody. Rick looked up. What? Ethan found pigs from 1890. Laughter exploded. Ethan kept drinking coffee, mostly ignoring it. Mostly. But privately. Something interesting started happening. The heritage hogs performed exceptionally well. Feed costs dropped. Health issues dropped. Pasture utilization improved. And local chefs began asking questions. Very specific questions. Questions nobody asked about standard pork. One autumn afternoon, a black pickup truck rolled into the farmyard. A man climbed out wearing a white chef's coat. He stood beside the pasture fence for nearly 10 minutes. Just watching the hogs. Watching them root through grass. Watching them move. Watching them eat. Then he turned toward Ethan and asked a question nobody in the county had ever asked before. How many of these can you produce? Ethan stared at the chef for several seconds. Because that wasn't a question people usually asked. Most people asked why. Why heritage hogs? Why pasture? Why spend grain? Why not raise pigs the normal way? Nobody asked how many he could produce. The chef stood patiently beside the fence, waiting. Finally, Ethan answered. Not many. The man nodded slowly. What if I wanted more? Silence. Then, how much more? The chef smiled. A lot. The man's name was Henry Lawson, executive chef for a growing restaurant group in Louisville. One of his suppliers told him about unusual pork coming from a farm outside town. So he drove out to see it himself. What he found surprised him. The hogs moved differently, looked different, lived differently, and apparently tasted different too. Henry pointed toward the pasture. Do they eat grain? Ethan nodded. Yes. What kind? Long pause. Then Ethan smiled. This is usually where people laugh. Henry folded his arms. Try me. Ethan pointed toward the distillery beyond the ridge. Spent mash. Silence. Then, the whiskey leftovers. Yes. Henry stared. Then looked back toward the hogs. Then laughed. Not mocking laughter. Interested laughter. That's actually brilliant. For a moment, Ethan thought he misheard him. Because nobody had ever called it brilliant before. Not once. Over the next 6 months, Henry bought every hog Ethan could finish. Then he bought more. Then he asked for future production. Then other chefs started calling. Then specialty butcher shops. Then premium meat distributors. Something strange was happening. The same county that laughed at Ethan for years suddenly had outsiders driving hundreds of miles looking for his pork. Dale Harper hated that. Not because he disliked Ethan. Because he hated being confused. One afternoon he drove out to the farm and stared at 3 restaurant delivery trucks parked beside the loading area. Then looked at Ethan. No. Ethan smiled. Yes. No. Yes. Dale pointed toward the trucks. Those aren't local. No. Why are they here? Ethan shrugged. Buying pigs. Silence. Then. Why? Ethan looked toward the pasture. Then toward the trucks. Then back again. Because they like pork. That answer irritated Dale immediately. As usual, the real breakthrough came 2 years later. Not because of the hogs. Because of the feed. One rainy afternoon, a distillery manager named Harold Briggs stopped beside the farm. He climbed out of a company truck and looked toward the feeding area. Thousands of pounds of spent mash sat beneath covered structures waiting for use. Harold shook his head. You know something? Ethan looked up. What? We've been paying people to haul this stuff away for years. Silence. Then, sounds expensive. Harold laughed. Very. Long pause. Then he looked across the operation. Pastures. Hogs. Feed systems. Employees. Loading facilities. Everything. You build all this from leftovers. Ethan thought about it, then shook his head. No. Harold frowned. No. Ethan pointed toward the fields. The pigs built it. That answer somehow annoyed Harold too. By 1999, the operation looked completely different. What started as a modest hog farm became one of the largest heritage pork producers in the region. Pastures expanded. Additional acreage got fenced. Breeding programs improved. Processing partnerships formed. Everything kept growing. Meanwhile, the spent grain never stopped arriving. Truck after truck. Week after week. Year after year. The distillery kept producing whiskey. The whiskey kept producing mash. And the mash kept feeding pigs. One autumn morning, Ethan stood on a hill overlooking the farm, while dozens of heritage hogs moved across rotating pasture systems below. Emily walked up carrying coffee. Remember when everyone laughed? Ethan smiled slightly. Yes. Remember Dale calling them 1890 pigs? Yes. She looked across the operation. Employees loaded premium pork shipments into refrigerated trailers below. Chefs visited regularly. Tour groups occasionally stopped by. The farm had become known throughout the state. Then Emily laughed. You know what's funny? What? She pointed toward the distillery. They still think they're getting rid of waste. Ethan looked toward the trucks unloading fresh mash. Steam rose from the grain in the cool morning air. Then he smiled. Because she was right. Most people looked at the spent grain and saw a disposal problem. The distillery saw leftovers. The county saw slop. Garbage. Waste. Worthless material. But Ethan spent years watching it. Studying it. Testing it. Learning from it. And eventually he realized something simple. The grain wasn't waste. It was unfinished. That became even clearer during a county agricultural meeting several years later. A speaker stood at the front discussing farm profitability. Markets, risk, production costs, the usual things. Then someone asked Ethan how he built such a successful operation. The room turned toward him. Farmers, ranchers, business owners, even Dale. Waiting. Ethan stood slowly. Not because he enjoyed public speaking. Because he didn't. Then he looked around the room and said something his grandfather would have appreciated. When everybody calls something worthless. Silence. Look at it twice. The room stayed quiet. Then he continued. 12 years before I took over this farm, trucks dumped spent mash behind our fence. He paused. Most people saw garbage. Long pause. I saw feed. The room remained silent. Because everyone there knew it was true. For years the distillery dumped mash at the Carter property because nobody else wanted it. For years farmers laughed at the idea of feeding it heavily. For years people mocked heritage hogs. Mocked pasture systems. Mocked old breeds. Mocked old ideas. Then restaurants started paying premium prices. Then distributors showed up. Then chefs drove across state lines. And suddenly nobody laughed anymore. Late that evening, Ethan stood beside the original eastern fence line where the first truck dumped spent grain back in 1983. The fence was newer now. The operation much larger. But the spot remained the same. A fresh distillery truck unloaded another steaming load nearby. The driver climbed out. You still taking this stuff? Ethan laughed. The exact same question he'd heard decades earlier. He looked across thousands of acres, hundreds of heritage hogs, and a business built from what others threw away. Then he smiled. Yes. And this time, nobody thought he was crazy.